before we get to this excellent interview, we would like to invite you to check out patreon.com/consensusunreality. It's where we release most of our episodes. Our full archive is hosted there, and follow-ups to our interviews. So check out patreon.com/consensusunreality for just $5 a month. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Cool. All right, welcome to another episode of Consensus on Reality. Today we're joined by Andy Sharp, the writer and multimedia artist behind the English Heretic project, the author of the English Heretic Collection, and recently the Astral Geographic, the Watkins Guide to the Occult World. And we're very pleased to have him on here today. Thanks for joining us, Andy. How's it going?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having us. Oh, it's going great. Yeah. Just to sort of finish off with the first bit, the main bit of promotion for the new book. So quite a lot of talk. So I think we've got last in public talk in about a week and a half, and then that's it for the rest of the year. So that's good. Get that done.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. We're both big fans of your books, especially English Heretic Collection. I think I picked up maybe a year ago, or maybe a year or two ago. I forget when, but I was thumbing through it in a bookshop, and I said English Heretic Collection. This sounds pretty cool. And then I'm thumbing through, and it's the Qliphoth and Kenneth Grant and Doctor Who, and I'm like, I need to get this. So I took it to the counter, and the guy at the counter was like, "This is a good one." So yeah.
Oh, good. That's really good to hear. Where are you based then? Where are you?
I'm in Philadelphia, and Ben is in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Pennsylvania. I have a bookshop here too, so it's got So I'm reading through the English Heretic Collection a bit, and I'm really fascinated by this process of like the black plaques. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect of your work?
Oh yeah. I mean, so in the UK, we've got this government quango called English Heritage. Well, it used to be a government quango. Can't quite remember what happened with it. And it's a sort of government funded body that looks after places of historic interest. A lot of ruins, really, and things like that. They also had this scheme called the Blue Plaque Scheme, where they put up these kind of ceramic plaques on in locations where famous people had lived or dwelled or something like that. So, there'd be a house in London where, say, someone like Dickens may have lived in the Blue Plaque Scheme. So, yeah, going back sort of 15, 20 years ago, I was kind of playing with the idea. I was actually releasing records in a project called Lost Objects, where I'd make these records and then I'd symbolically leave them at kind of venues of kind of significance. And in actual fact, one of the places I did one of these lost objects was this place called Chislehurst Caves, where they'd filmed Doctor Who. So, I kind of was playing on sort of kind of this idea of kind of like a situationist type thing. But anyway, it sort of developed into like a particular commemoration with this guy called Michael Reeves, who was the director of Witchfinder General. And I kind of got interested in his biography, because I at the time I was living in a town called Ipswich in Suffolk, where it turned out that he was cremated. So it was actually my route to work. I was driving past the cemetery and the crematorium where he'd been cremated, and I sort of thought about, well, maybe I'm picking up on some sort of channeling his spirit or something like that. And then I started doing field recordings there, and sort of evolved the idea of the lost object into a black plaque, which was a CD recording, and it was kind of a pastiche of the Blue Plaque commemorations, and I laid that at the tree that was in the area of the crematorium that his ashes were spread. So it was done like that. And then I thought it played around with the idea of like subverting English heritage into kind of occult version, really quite playful reading, and say like kind of situationist. So blue plaques became black plaques, and sites of heritage became sites of heresy and things like that. And that was the evolution of it, really. And so the various different blue plaques, the black plaques kind of evolved sort of organically. I'd find some connection or synchronicity that would lead me on to another person. So it was always with this kind of sort of concept of rapport with tragic figures, or, you know, strange histories and strange biographies, really. Yeah, but it was always done with a kind of, as I say, you know, kind of serendipitous and rather than go think, oh, I need to do one for him and him, it was kind of an organic process, and that's kind of the way it worked. Yeah, so that's what backpacks were.
Yeah, that's great. I love the way chance comes into that. When I was reading through the book, and the other book as well, kind of like how these forces of chance, place, and time all kind of like converge into this like this path that lays out before you. And so I really like that approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, because, you know, I wanted, you know, I'm also interested in magic and occultism, but it's always, you know, it's always really been about driving the creative process. So I'm interested in creative occultism, really. And I get, you know, Kenneth Grant was very interested in creative occultism. Yeah. So, but living by that sort of kind of dictum that you know, that the creative path and the magical path are quite intertwined, that it feels necessary that the kind of project evolves in a magical way, rather than in a kind of a way that's divorced from a you know, kind of all the things about magic, you know, there's synchronicities rather than logic and things like that, associative thinking and things like that. So I think that's where the kind of English Heretic sort of differs from other sort of projects in the Selm realm, when we're, you know, celebrating Weird Britain and things like that. That actually the kind of narrative was always driven by I wouldn't say chance, serendipity, you know, and magical kind of significance, really. So synchronicity. So yeah, that was that kind of a unique way that it kind of evolved, really. But that was kind of the way I work, really, you know.
It's also a way of subverting the different forms of media you were working in too, right? Because it's comprised of music and sort of like zines, but also this writing that culminated into the collection.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely a kind of a way of using form and playing with form as a conceit, because the magazine and CD thing was, I mean, a lot of people do it now, but there weren't a lot of people doing this sort of thing back in the day. But my kind of again, it was another subversion. We used to have in this country, used to have like and they went into the States, magazines like Man, Myth and Magic and The Unexplained, which are these parts magazines. And and then, like, for the first edition of Unexplained, it came with a flexi disc of like EVP recordings and things like that. So I was playing on that concept of these kind of magazines that we used to get, you know, in parts, and you'd get like a freebie with it, things like that. And like the first edition, I created these giant boxes, like they were called, I can't remember what they're called, like sepulchres or something like that, and it cost me about 10 quid to ship out, and these people got these huge bricks. But by about the 7th, 8th issue, this kind of box had filled out, and people were going, "Can we have another box?" I was like, "I'm not going to do that." So it's kind of all these ludicrous things I was doing with it as well, but always at my own expense, really, in a lot of ways. I remember this guy once was like, "Oh, I like the box, but the clip doesn't quite work. Can I have a replacement clip?" So again, it's like situationism, but you know, this sort of ludicrous sort of operating, sort of, you know, in a sense, like kind of satirizing kind of consumerism as well, to a certain degree, you know.
Right. And that reminds me of like in the States in the aughts, the noise scene was kind of this burst and boom, and there was like American Tapes, which is the label of one of the members of Wolf Eyes and stuff, but they had all this crazy elaborate packaging, like chicken wire cassette tapes and stuff like that.
Remember them? Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's, I would say, it is an art project, but it's a kind of creative occultism, creative research. So but all these things, how do you deliver things in a way that's meaningful, but also, fun in a way, and
right.
and but also, subverting kind of the idea of making a package and a thing, something like that to a certain degree.
Yeah. Is the new book, which is, it's the Watkins Guide to the Occult World, and it's kind of written in this travelogue form. Is that further experiments in this play with form, like the
absolutely, yeah, totally nailed it there. Absolutely, yeah. So Watkins are Repeater's parent company, and after Repeater put out the anthology, their publisher got in touch with me about doing something for them, and I came up with this idea of doing a travel guide, but I didn't want it to be, again, I wanted it to be a narrative driven exploration, but use form in a particular way. So, like J.G. Ballard was doing with the Trossi exhibition, playing with form and having these condensed chapters. I thought, well, you can create. So these chapters are there's a strong narrative arc to the itineraries, the travels in there. They're meant to be a story. They're not meant to be sort of disconnected dots on a page. These are the places to go associated with whatever. It was, it's very much curated, that trip, and it's meant to be read as you say, as a book, really, but with the conceit of a travel guide. So yeah, that was, I'm not sure whether Watkins wanted me to do that, but I wanted to do that, and I kind of, in the end, the kind of, I had, they were quite happy in the end with the kind of editorial narratives. Very little, it's copy editing and things like that. But they didn't chop and change any of the itineraries because as I explained to them why I'd done it in a particular way. Yeah, so I'm very pleased with it.
Yeah,
getting away with it. Getting away with playing,
I mean, I think the perfect example of that in that book for me, it's a story obviously we're very interested in, but Crowley and Neuberg, the Choronzon working in the desert, but you're presenting it in this very compressed form. But it's surprising that it's still extrapolating new novel information, and it's looking at it from a different angle, which is a story that's kind of told often enough where you think that this wouldn't even be possible anymore. But I enjoyed that chapter so much, and it had me kind of rethinking the meaning of Choronzon in general, and the meaning of maybe the role that Choronzon plays in synchro-mystic thought and the kind of chasing of coincidence and the unmanifested and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I love that chapter, because actually, as you say, I've been obsessed with that particular story in Crowley's life for probably about since I was 18. I remember, I think I first read about it in one of Colin Wilson's biographies, and it was just the thing that blew my mind, really, and it still continues to blow my mind. But actually, really approaching it in a kind of quite pure way to begin with for the book. As you say, all these kind of new inferences really grew up, this kind of idea that actually it was very progressive. He was almost like ahead of his time in terms of like occult psychogeography, and also this kind of like fusion of kind of Enochian magic and then taking it out to the desert seems like very experimental, but it shows, the power of it. He made a very, very, people criticize Crowley, but that was a very intuitive move, really, so all the imagery of, they had this, that ruby topaz gem that they were scrying with, and obviously it kind of colored the visions as well. So even that's very interesting, but kind of digging into, as I developed that, thinking about the kind of not just the Christian implications of it for Crowley. Obviously he's like Temptation of St. Anthony and Christ in the desert. You've also got the kind of Arabian folkloric elements of the Djinn and the Ghoul and stuff like that, which obviously are kind of seep into the kind of the figure of Corazon, and I talked about it at Watkins' bookshop, and there was an Egyptian guy, and he says, yeah, Majun means possessed, means crazy, and things like that. So, I think a lot of these kind of insights they're speculative, but they're very cogent, and I really enjoyed that chapter. And also, kind of extrapolating it to stuff like, the cult of Corazon, the whole way that Chaos Magic adopted it, and Parsons and Chaos Magic, Kenneth Grant, and then looking at the outlier in it, which is very significant, I think, which is Burroughs' Cities of Red Night, and kind of pestilential desert, really.
Yeah, I like that the way you connected Burroughs in there. He seems to come up, if not like explicitly, then implicitly a lot in some of the 20th century, like later 20th century occult stuff, his ideas. Do you find that happening a lot, like just running into Burroughs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's underplayed a bit. I mean, I remember reading an interview with J.G. Ballard, who was very skeptical of the occult. He said Burroughs wasn't interested in it at all. Much as I, admire J.G. Ballard, love his work, he's completely wrong on that, because Burroughs, there's, in Cities of Red Night, the two detectives are doing like sex magic in order to solve this kind of weird crime with these ginger-headed boys getting abducted and decapitated. It's just, he was doing sex magic, to drive the book. But the really interesting thing from my perspective is the name, the four names of the seven cities of the Red Night, which come from. I only found this out in the last 2 or 3 years, came from the Picatrix. Brian Geisen had taught Burroughs this method of lucid dreaming, which is a ritual called perfect nature. And you're meant to recite these 4 words before going to sleep. And when I reread Cities of Red Night, I think the last time, I've read it about 4 times. I read it sort of a decade apart. And every time, this book's quite alive in a lot of ways. And this whole kind of episodes of kind of this stuff that is quite clearly taken from lucid dreaming and things like that. So yeah, Burroughs was definitely doing magic. And the weird thing was, I did a talk in Bristol, and a woman called Liz Williams was running it, who wrote a really good book on paganism. And I was saying to her, my kind of entry to occultism was a book called A Magic and Occult Primer by this guy called David Conway, who was a pseudonym for a guy who worked in government and wrote this book that was very famous. And I first heard about this book in an interview with Burroughs, who said, if you want to read a good book on magic, read David Conway's Magic and Occult Primer. Anyway, so at this talk in Bristol, Liz says, I was explaining to her, and she goes, "Oh, I know David Conway very well. I'll give you a copy of his book, my book, and sign it." And so the weird life goes in a weird magical circle in lots of ways.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you too. I'm sure you have to be familiar with the stone tape theory, and I feel like your work, especially with the English Heretic Project, kind of conjures like a more poetic stone tape theory. Does that resonate with you and Lethbridge's work?
Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting. I hadn't really considered it in that way, but there are definite. I think there's a chapter in the new book about sinister megaliths, which is very much stone tape theory and tying in with kind of nuclear semiotics. But that poetic element, I kind of realized sort of 10 years, well, when I was actually putting together the anthology, that actually the kind of that mythopoetic thing comes a lot from Robert Graves, really. The White Goddess. So, a parallel text to Lethbridge. These kind of these really quite seductive sort of confabulations of history through a poetic lens and through words and things like that. So yeah, absolutely, that's what it is. But yeah, the stone tape theory, I think I think there's a couple of kind of examples, I suppose, in English Heretic that seem to relate to that. There's a little bit that I'm talking about Avebury and kind of the Kenneth Grant stuff to a certain degree is, when I'm looking at places like Orford Ness, which are kind of atomic research facilities, and looking as if they're kind of these kind of Lovecraftian temples and stuff like that. So there's an element of that, I think, in that particular work. This kind of idea of circular time and what the real function of these places are in a quite outlandish way, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I think at one point I was convinced it was a Lovecraftian landing site.
It's awesome. I feel like in reading your stuff, I become maybe aware. It's like almost like a mirror of like the American identity and like of place and the kind of like symbols that we have in our lore. It seems to be more like almost archetypally primordial, like Greys and Men in Black and Hat Men, because there's not this like thickness of history, because our colonialism is only like 200 years. But it seems like with your work, there's like a denser field. Like it makes everything feel just like these layers stack up. And then the 20th century is just putting these meta layers on top of everything.
Yeah, but I also noticed, because as I said, for 15 years or 12 years of the project before I moved to London, I was living in Suffolk, and I noticed this huge overlay between Suffolk and the estates, because the place names were all kind of imported into America when the Pilgrim Fathers sailed from kind of Essex and came from Suffolk. So you've got places called Ipswich and Kersey, which were kind of places that are used in Witchfinder General. So in a weird way, I thought one of the most interesting things was, and I probably wasn't explicit enough, was this kind of weird overlay between New England and England, and obviously the kind of the extrapolation there is kind of Lovecraft, really, and you're right, absolutely. This kind of new. Hadn't thought about that. I mean, about what you're saying about the thinness of your history, creating this kind of mythology of Greys and Mothmen and stuff like that. And I think it's really interesting because certainly in Britain, I was looking at the kind of 20th century eruptions of things that might have been perceived as witchcraft they were, in certain areas of Suffolk, where they went searching for strange lights, and a century later they were doing the same things in Rendlesham Forest, and that was a US Air Force base as well. So, ironically enough, they're the biggest kind of UFO. But there's a whole, I mean, this is really interesting because you've also got kind of the parapolitics there, so was Rendlesham, like a black ops type thing, to
Jacob's Ladder type thing,
conceal what was really going on at Rendlesham. There's kind of there's certain anecdotes that they were actually storing nuclear weapons at Rendlesham. They were trying to decoy it to Greenham Common, where all the protesters were. So there's all that, so you tend to get where you get this kind of this military sort of occultism. You have this weird layer of kind of psyops as well.
Yeah. And I feel like it's also like I feel like it's related to like the identity thing of like the self-made man in America. And to me, you see that so clearly in someone like Carlos Castaneda or something. Obviously there's always a trickster element too, and kind of a strange interpretation of Native American folklore through the settler lens as well. But
yeah, Castaneda's a really interesting person. Okay, yeah, he was confabulating it, but doesn't mean it's not true.
Yeah.
In some sort of mythic respect. His books are, I do think there's a kind of like a shamanic reality that he's getting across in these books. So and it's, as you say, the strong trickster tradition. But Castaneda, people like Kenneth Grant could see parallels between their kind of bozone and the Nagual that's in Separate Reality. I think Separate Reality is an incredible book, to be honest. And I think it influenced a lot of the stuff I was doing, to be honest. Keel and Castaneda is definitely in there in terms of the kind of the element of trickster, because what was driving the narrative in English Heretic was the trickster. As I said, it wasn't this kind of prescribed route. I was going to go, I'll do weekly, then I'll do this. It happened organically, and I put that down to the trickster, essentially. Within myself and within the kind of transpersonal realm, really. Absolutely, yeah. So I was consciously playing, not consciously, but I became aware of it, and I probably had given someone like John Keel enough credence, when I wrote the kind of, when I wrote the anthology obviously was an anthology, and I forgot to mention that actually, Keel was a big part of the book, in terms of his kind of that kind of very playful kind of disruption of reality.
Absolutely. Did you have a favorite Keel book that you were looking at, or?
I like Disneyland the Gods.
It's one of the first books we covered on this podcast.
Is it? Yeah, no, it's a fantastic book. And it's Mothman Prophecies. I find it very eerie, something very creepy about that. But I like the fact that he came out. There's a guy called David Clark, who's a ufologist in this country, or studies it. I think quite skeptical, but he was explaining how kind of Keel was the man in black, because when they were investigating the Mothman stuff, they were doing it as a journalistic sort of thing, and they went along in their suits and their car broke down, so they traipsed through the fields in these black suits covered in mud, or they up to their sort of thighs in mud. They went to these houses and asked these people, can we get a car fixed? And then they went back a few weeks later, and these people reported these odd events where these men in black turned up with mud all over their things, and he realized that and the anecdote there is, I am the man in black. I love that. It's just so poetic and weird and Phil Dickian, in a weird way. You are, the figure of who you're hunting, essentially. Like, it's very strange and fun, really.
Yeah, we're creating a weird like feedback loop there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's great. So I guess all the Witchfinder General stuff in the book got me thinking about folk horror and that sort of thing, and that the rootedness of that to place. And I feel like we kind of got there just now in the conversation, but is there, can folk horror be, at least like the English kind of folk horror that film is a part of, can it be like transplanted? Is it something like, because you don't see it coming out in America quite as much, this kind of folk horror, maybe like what Dave was saying about the relatively thin history here. Like, do you think that there's,
Well, I think it's an evolution, because I think Robert Eggers' Witch is very much an evolution of Blood and Satan's Claw, because you've got this quite claustrophobic community that's slowly being driven mad, one by like this, Blood and Satan's Claw is this sort of possessed, again, it's like a possessed girl, isn't it, who might be in league with the devil, and then in the Witch you've got the kids who it might be in league with the goat and things like that. So I think what happens, and I think it's great, is and what I really like about the film is it's developing English folk horror and realizing that actually we can transplant it. So that's a really good example of a really successful American folk horror film that is successful in its own right, but it's obviously influenced by things like Blood and Satan's Claw. And then obviously you've also got in a different context you've also got Midsommar, that was obviously kind of quite influenced by Wicker Man, but done in Swedish community, and you know, both films get a bit of criticism, but I loved them both. You know, I thought they were superb. You know, and I you know, I'd much rather these days see new developments of the genre than, you know, just celebrating, you know, films, you know, in a kind of, you know, a way that, because I guess what I'm saying is that I was disappointed in the amount of criticism that something like Midsommar and to a certain degree The Witch got, when I think they were great. You know, I think they were evolving and both intelligent films and beautifully done as well, you know. So and funny in a weird way, you know. There was elements of the kind of humor that you get both in A Wicker Man and Blood and Satan's Claw.
Yeah,
films, you know.
Yeah, I feel like maybe the amount of criticism kind of speaks to how thin the art house films are that are like the amount is that, you know, the lens was like turned onto those movies, because I thought they were, you know, great, at least theater movies too. I mean, Midsommar, no matter what you thought of that movie, it was so visceral seeing it in the theater, that like the ups and downs and everything. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and visually stunning as well. Yeah, absolutely.
And The Witch, I really like The Witch too. Yeah.
Yeah, again, visually stunning, but with a completely different palette, an incredibly grey palette. You know, beautiful though.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's funny. It's funny. I don't really. For some reason, obviously, Midsommar comes to mind, but for some reason, The Witch didn't come to mind as like a folklore thing. But of course, it is. Yeah. I wonder why that is. Yeah.
I sometimes think because he's so fed the kind of traditional folk horror that it's sometimes hard to see real new folk horror. You know, sometimes it's weirdly blinded by blindsided by the fact that sort of folk horror feels that it has to be in the past. You know, it has to be a film that came out 50 years ago as opposed to today.
Yeah, for sure. I like in the chapter on war generally. All the stuff about Churchill I found like so interesting. Because I mean, I'm sure it's different depending where one kind of is rooted, but he has a certain image here that is, I'm sure, very different than the one he has over there. And so, like, what was it sort of like digging into the Churchill mythos a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, again, that came out of that. I did this kind of like, it was pastiche of kind of like commemorative sort of nonsense you get in the UK, like, you know, Britain at war, Britain at cop, and also kind of it was one of, you know, in Britain you get lots of these kind of horrible sort of channels that are like Channel Nazi, where they're always doing like the occult roots of Nazism and stuff like that. I just felt, you know, if I'm going to tackle occult war, let's do it from a completely different angle. And again, that happened organically. So the second black plaque I did was for John F. Kennedy's brother, who died in Suffolk in this mad mission where his plane blew up full of like explosives that they were sort of trying to radio control towards these bunkers that the Germans had built in North France. So that black plaque developed organically, and then I got sort of interested in how do I kind of subvert the whole idea of Britain at war and Britain at occult. So I did this project called Britain at Occult War, which was deliberately kind of quite provocative in the sense that I wanted to kind of disrupt our, you know, the kind of the bunting and jingoism and patriotism and kind of like this sort of sad sort of desire to live in the Blitz and stuff like that. And in actual fact, you know, there's a kind of still this kind of like mentality that kind of is quite deleterious in Britain. So I was kind of wanting to like poke fun at that in a lot of ways. And the best person to poke fun and ridicule is obviously someone like Churchill. But obviously then, you know, the more I dug into kind of Churchill, I found that he was initiated to druidic order and stuff like that. And, I mean, this is all true, you know. And so you know, that was obviously like the perfect kind of nugget of information to really go to town and just like just play around with it and turn it around inside out and things like that and see how far you could go. But yeah, it was, you know, it was definitely a poke at kind of like the way that we revere or certain certain sectors of society revere and kind of wish we were still living in the Second World War, or feel we are, but so but as you say, like, and they were, and then I suddenly, suddenly more I got into it, there's a part of me that actually then starts to believe this, my own kind of subversion, thinking, well, yeah, he's a druid, he had like mastery of speech, and he wrote, he was like a warrior poet, and he wrote all these speeches. So if you really take it as far in an occult lens, then you can see that, oh yeah, he would be like Merlin or something like that, and then like these connections between Merlin like losing this battle and going into having this kind of breakdown and going into a forest with a black dog, and then Churchill having being responsible for the butcher of Gallipoli in the First World War, and then having a breakdown on that. It's like, so there's part of me that in this kind of like really hyperbolic, over the top way that creates this occult answer to history, if you like. Some people take it seriously and others don't. And I don't know whether I do, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't,
Yeah.
For sure.
Have you had like an interest in like exotica and stuff too? And maybe this is a way to transition into a mutual interest of ours in Kenneth Grant.
When you mean exotica, do you mean like kind of like teak, that sort of stuff, like music? That exotica, or are you talking about like occult exotica and stuff like that?
I kind of, it's a I guess it is kind of vague, but to me they kind of, there's this bleed, reading a lot of things like Kenneth Grant, and even thinking about Crowley and kind of the first touring exhibitions of the Egyptian tombs and stuff. It seems that like from the top down, there's elements of exotica and theosophy too. There's kind of that cultural appropriation that isn't malevolent, but it's like kind of simulating a new world. But yeah, then of course there's a music thing and stuff too. Because I know that you did the. I saw you made a disc that was music of the new Isis Lodge, and
a musical, possibly the only musical based on Kenneth Grant books. It didn't get to the West End, unfortunately, or Broadway or whatever. But yeah, that was the idea. It was like my idea were, it'd be. But yeah, you are right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Grant's stuff is really kind of syncretic and out there, because he's he references like in lots of different ways. It's layered because it's got pulp in there as well. So he's looking at Chinese black magic, and he's interested in voodooism and hyena cults and stuff like that. And it's this wild kind of like anthropology on top of everything else that's in Grant, and I love it for that. I found, and I think he's a xenophile, really. I think he, as you say, it's not a malevolent appropriation. It's a love of like kind of this fascinating the kind of pan-cultural elements of occultism, really, and and tantra as well. And his writings on tantra are really, really interesting. But yeah, so absolutely, I love that, and it's a big part of it, and I think it's also a big part of the Astral Geographic. I'm trying to very much go on that. There's a chapter on tantra in there, which is kind of, I got interested in tantra through Grant, but suddenly found some other stuff that Grant stuff is sometimes couched in this sort of crazy Kabbalah, and sometimes think, oh, this is just all made up. But in most cases, like, they bear out, the references bear out, and so there will be like an anthropological root to it. And then once you discover that anthropological source to the Grant stuff, then you can go off in a different direction. So he's been fantastic for that. But the way he kind of melds stuff is so strange. He wrote a lot about kind of these rituals. This guy called John Levy did, who was an ethnomusicologist who went to the Bhutan in 1970 and recorded the kind of Nyamangba and Drugpa sects. And these really kind of doomy rituals that sound like swans or something like that. And Grant wrote about it, and I discovered it discovered them through Grant, so he's and then of course Grant takes it further and says actually they're kind of getting in touch with Lovecraftian entities, which is even better. It's just this. Do you see what I mean? It's just this, that just that suddenly, this kind of like, anthropology becomes just blown out into realms of like cosmic strangeness, and I love that. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't lock it up in a glass case. It's very much still alive and going out, sent out into the cosmos. Essentially, yeah. How does one find Kenneth Grant as a teenager?
How did I?
Yeah.
I mean, I think I probably saw it in the book lists in research books, industrial culture. So it would have been like Throbbing Gristle, Genesis, Theologist book lists, and I would have seen that reference. And then there was one countercultural shop in London, in Camden, that everybody used to go to, and everybody I know. It subsequently closed down, and that was called Compendium. And I found a copy of Outside the Circles of Time there in the sort of mid-'80s, and that must have been knocking around that shop for about 5 years without anybody buying it. It was yellowed even by the time I got it, but obviously there's no internet to kind of debunk this stuff. So, reading this when I was 17, 18, I thought, this is true. This is this is fact. And I'm quite happy I had that sort of like formative upbringing. So I was sure it sent my, walked my mind in a quite nice way, quite a pleasurable way, but I think sadly, people who try to debunk it, it belonged in a time where, it was fantastical and things like that.
I call it a para history, it's like it's a
absolutely.
Who knows? But how can you test the reality of it if it's astral? It's an astral history. Exactly.
And I think a lot of all the criticisms that people make about particularly Grant's like sort of creative Kabbalah, and I think the analogy again I give is like the bits in Burroughs books where he's cutting up and stuff like that. That's Grant doing the same thing to make these associations, to take it on, to create this kind of disrupt the linear progress and find new kind of juxtapositions. And but whereas Burroughs is doing it through cut up, I think Grant's doing it through creative Kabbalah. So he's making these associations between concepts based on the kind of like Kabbalistic equivalent, and suddenly it makes this association, and the book goes off in another direction. And that's why I've tried to. I wrote an essay for a fanzine on Coil, and that's my way of explaining why it's important to sit with Grant through those kind of weird chicanes and treat them as if they're deliberate disruptions to shift the consciousness slightly further.
Yeah, and
it's funny for people to read Grant as like an authority or something.
Historian,
or like when he's really just like an experimenter of some kind, or
absolutely,
So I always thought that the criticisms of him as like inarticulate or blatantly incorrect. It's like, well, so what? That's not really the point.
But also, the other thing is that these books are meant to be read like they're like kind of Necronomicons, that they're kind of these living texts that tend you into a very strange place. And he was deliberately doing this. When people asked, there's an interview with him in Starfire or something, and he's asked, what is the purpose of these books? And he's to say, and he says, to acquaint people with very strange states of consciousness.
Yeah, right.
Brilliant. Acquaint them. So
Have you ever tried to extract like kind of the reality of the New Isis Lodge? I was reading this essay recently, which was talking about Austin Osman Spare and Kenneth Grant's real life relationship, and kind of hamming it up at the bar late night and stuff. because it makes me very, reading something like Hecate's Fountain, you get very curious at what exactly like this scene looked like in this reality,
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. It's a great question. And I know there's a book called Zoss Speaks, which is all about kind of Kenneth Grant's diaries about him meeting Spare, and Spare was kind of making stuff up for Steffi.
Tall tales.
And Steffi and Kenneth Grant, and then Kenneth Grant created a mythos from it, which I think is great, But yeah, Hecate's Fountain is my favorite Grant book, and it for exactly that reason, this kind of these houses in North London where they were having like coffins with slugs coming out of it, and like decked out like the Himalayas and stuff like that, and So he was friendly with a guy called David Kerwin. David Kerwin was a kind of tantric alchemist. I know where Kerwin's house was and where they supposedly met, and that's in sort of Houston in London. But the nature of the rituals, I suspect that these are all done on the astral, really. There were possibly group workings to a certain degree, where they would like visualize a lodge and visualize settings and stuff like that, and then work it in that way. That's my assumption to a certain degree, or maybe. But there's hints, in on some of the photographs in Outside the Circle of Time. You got those little magical mannequins and that altars and stuff like that. So maybe they had like smaller like little altars that they visualize into these bigger scenes, or use like mannequins and things like that. So I doubt whether there were these kind of like shantak birds on wires going down some house in North London, but I wonder whether they were like playing with mannequins and stuff like that. And but they were also using, he was getting his oracular assistants to read kind of Saxaroma and stuff like that. So they would be reading these kind of pulp horror fictions in order to seed their kind of visions as well. So there was a bit of that as well going on as well. But yeah, I think my assumption is that it was mainly on the astral, but maybe there were these kind of small artifacts that they kind of used as in a psychometric way. The dagger of Boussard or something. Cause I talk about that in the Astral Geographic, and it relates to that ritual in Hecate's Fountain, where someone runs out of the lodge and gets the dagger of Boussard and bursts this globule of like Lovecraftian ichor or something like that.
It's insane.
So whether that actually happened, or whether they kind of like visualized that happening and stuff like that.
I have to believe
how he pulpifies like the rituals, like the way he writes them. So
they're amazing, aren't they? They're just like, what? This is going on in what?
Yeah,
I mean, I read that when it came out. So it came out in '94, and I was living in London, that area. So I was kind of in South London, quite near where Spare lived, and also I found out a few years ago that I was living sort of 2 streets away from where Saxaroma used to live as well. So I was kind of tapping into all this kind of strange stuff, really. It felt very real, and these kind of these strange, black magic cults in London, the cult of the coup and stuff like that. It's just amazing, But yeah, you are right. The way he wrote these rituals is fantastic. He's definitely got a sort of powerful horror imagination there, because they all go disastrously wrong, don't they? Also, it's a tangential tantra comes from. Right. They all go wrong. But they're all, because the idea of Hecate's Fountains is a book about where tangents happen, so whether there were any rituals that ever went okay, and he just didn't put it into his book. It's very funny, it's fantastically. And you can see it in I think Alan Moore really appreciates Kenneth Grant, and obviously Grant Morrison and stuff like that. So
those consumed by the old ones, poor Clanda the witch. That's incredible though. That had to be amazing reading that at that time. It was pretty profound.
It was incredible. Being in London as well, so I'd be going down to these areas and thinking, shit, which house is it? Which house?
Could still see the slime on the side of the building.
Yeah.
Was Francis King very important to you as well, or?
Not really. No, I mean, I read his book on Crowley. His biography of Crowley was pretty good, but he was quite dismissive of Crowley, wasn't he? But he's a good biographer. There's lots of really interesting stuff in. What was his book on Crowley called?
The Magical Something of Aleister Crowley, and
that's right. Yeah.
There's also
some really good stuff like the. The kind of violin workings he did and stuff. What's that called?
Oh, yes. I'm forgetting her name.
Yeah, Layla Waddell.
Yes, right.
Yeah, so they were really interesting. His kind of information on that gave me a real good sense of kind of ritual music and stuff like that. So yeah, I do actually really like Francis King as he's got a. Yeah, he's a smart guy. Yeah.
I thought he kept it pretty straight in that biography. I like that, and it's kind of like tells the greatness of Crowley, but also the real life trail of wickedness he left into the people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so but I mean, I love the book, but I don't think he's really been an influence on the project itself. I would say, it's kind of more. It's kind of more psychonauts who are the influence on it, as I said, like John Keel, Robert Anton Wilson. Obviously, the things the whole kind of his approach to synchronicity and stuff like that. So Robert Anton Wilson's a very big influence on the way my kind of thinking as well. Philip K. Dick to a certain degree.
Yeah, I could see that. I liked how, because I wouldn't have. It's not in the style, like some people influenced by Wilson will kind of like take on his thing, whereas with you it seems more like the mechanics behind how Wilson approaches things were the influence, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, not rather than take on his kind of particular obsessions, but that's just the fact that I was reading him at a formative age and he was a big influence, and I like the way he kind of polarizes you in a book, and I kind of wanted to do, I guess you learn that method of polarization through people like Robert Anton Wilson, to be able to polarize the reader and switch their kind of, view of reality. And, I enjoy that happening when I'm writing myself and discovering the stuff. So it's nice to be able to do that, to attempt to do that for other people. And obviously Philip K. Dick was fantastic at that, switching reality and polarizing the reader, polarizing their sensibilities quite quick succession, really.
Yeah, I noticed Dion Fortune comes up quite a bit. What are your thoughts generally on her and her influence?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I wrote about her in this book as well. So, I was kind of a bit tongue in cheek about her stuff she was doing for Second World War. It was all a bit kind of, it was quite ineffective, really. And quite self-important in a way. This idea that they were building this cone of whatever it was, peace, wasn't it? Protective cone above the country by doing these group workings. So I was a little bit tongue in cheek about that in that book, but in the Astral Geographic, I'm kind of effusive in my praise of a book called Sea Priestess, because I visited this place called Brean Down in Somerset, which is a kind of natural promontory. And it's got this amazing kind of late 19th century fort that looks like a military temple, and it's where Fortune based her novel The Sea Priestess, and I think she did an amazing sort of, again, like kind of ahead of the curve, kind of making this kind of connection between these military structures and some sort of Atlantean sort of temple and stuff like that. I loved that. I thought she was amazing. I thought that was an amazing bit of imaginative transformation, ahead of its time, So whilst, kind of stuff that I think she was doing, for the magical defense of Britain is a little bit, it's a kind of bit silly. I think her concept of the sea priestess is brilliantly transported in a very progressive way, and like, Coyle 50 years on, come up with this idea of snowfalls on military temples and stuff like that. And she was doing exactly this like in the 30s. So yeah, I've got a lot of time for it. And I actually, I love Psychic Self-Defense. The book is a brilliant book, because it's all got, it was the first book I read on occultism. And it had all about the Cliff-Oth in there, and kind of psychic vampirism, and like what's not to like about all those sort of black lodges and stuff like that. It was, it wasn't New Age stuff. It's quite dark, some dark ideas in that. So yeah, I've got a lot of time for, in general, yeah. Maybe not a World War II astral protection.
Well, yeah, it's kind of similar to like the people who are like hexing Donald Trump when he was elected. There's sort of it's like, well, what are you going to do?
I know, exactly, it's kind of
yeah.
It's a little bit self-important, I think.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Way,
Yeah.
Showing up to the wrong battlefield or something, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing in the Second War started because they were meant to meet in London, but the train got delayed, didn't they? So they decided to do like group workings at different locations. It was all the train got delayed, wasn't it?
Wow, that's amazing. It's funny too. Have you been aware that like the strange comparison you make with Kenneth Grant and J.G. Ballard? There's also I don't know if this is like a current or something, but the Pennyroyal podcast has kind of like in similar terrain where they talk about Ballard, but also they're dealing with Kenneth Grant's kind of the groups that developed off of him in America and stuff, specifically in Ohio and stuff. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean the kind of connection I made with Grant, and there's a few connections really. They're both really interested in surrealism as a kind of more than like a potent sort of form of magic. They both kind of saw it as this kind of, in a sense, like a kind of magical practice. And so there's whereas. And Ballard talks about like kind of nostalgia as like kind of this violently kind of like violent events and stuff like that, or a car that's crashed. It has this kind of dark magic associated with a sort of dark nostalgia. So when you visit a pound, you've got a sense of the trauma there, but it's kind of this shell. And I thought that's like Cliff-Oth really, and Grant looks, Grant's perception of the Cliff-Oth as these kind of shells that hold this kind of dark nostalgia and magical nostalgia, and that's where I really saw a really strong connection, in this kind of deleterious kind of, ruins of kind of the progressive science and progressive history and things like that. But again, like the interesting thing is that the bit that really joins them comes from Robert Anton Wilson, because Robert Anton Wilson quotes Ruskin and his concept of Ilth, and I think it was Robert Anton Wilson called it like kind of the Cliff-Oth, or said that this is kind of a deleterious, or called Ilth like the deleterious sort of byproduct of scientific progress and stuff like that. So Ballard constantly talks about the kind of like this dark magic around what's it called, like military sites and things like that, weapons ranges, but also he talks about like kind of like it's got this weird sort of nostalgia about like hotels and all these places of transition, these kind of empty spaces and things like that, which feels very, very like the kind of void that the powerful void that Grant's talking about. In the
For some reason, that just made me think of the whole idea of these like abandoned or unused military installations. coupled with sort of Lovecraftian or kind of, you know about like the Montauk Project mythos?
Not really, no. I mean, I've heard the name, but
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
just it's sort of like on Long Island here in New York, there's an old military base with a giant sort of satellite, and there's just been this mythology built up around it that there were these horrible experiments going on about like sending people backward and forward in time and all
oh
this,
right,
and it's like this aura that happens around like abandoned or no longer in use military installations. It seems to happen here too, you know?
yeah. Well, I think this is where these buildings, and this goes back to where it sort of links with the stone tape stuff and nuclear semiotics. Is because these buildings are built with a very specific function, but when they cease to function, and when time will cease to understand what their purpose was, they'll have this kind of mystery. It's almost like a religious mystery about them, because you've lost the kind of form and function of being divorced from each other, but they've got very specific goals. In terms of like a nuclear reactor, why huge encased concrete and stuff like that. Why did they build this particular structure? And I think that's exactly it. What happens there is that the paranoid imagination feeds on this kind of literally like a void of meaning or understanding of function and form and function. And I think we see that in military bases as they get abandoned. They become like. I went to one in Suffolk called Bordsey, that was where they had the Bloodhound missiles. And now when I went there 15, 20 years ago, it's completely abandoned. You can just wander around it. And these are like a giant squash courts that they used to house these Bloodhound missiles, and obviously no there. And they actually look more like those kind of Aztec arenas where they used to do those violent blood sports and stuff like that. And I thought, well, yeah, wow. But in actual fact, that's what they are. They are kind of solar temples, and stuff like that. So sometimes, actually the real function, the real mythic function is often like the military function.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, that's funny. I think the installation at Montauk was like a massive radar station, which kind of speaks to what you're saying. It's blasting the signal, but then becomes like the inverse, like a black hole for signal, and becomes kind of this mother of conspiracy theory.
Yeah. There's these similar golf ball type installations up in Yorkshire that are constantly, it's like exactly the same sort of myth of kind of, alien skullduggery or whatever, or some sinister operation. But in a way, as I say, the quotition function is actually the mythic function here. These places, if you think about it on like on a grand scale.
And so in your work, like what kind of credence do you give to the idea of an egregore? Because I know I've heard you talk about kind of the, experiencing letting synchromysticism or whatever you want to call it kind of ride in a poetic way, and just kind of like experiencing it novel for yourself. But do you think that like things can actually kind of like build and reify themselves as cultural egregores from fiction? I guess that's
I totally do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it happens personally in your own life all the time. I think you're always, I think the imagination does create a kind of a form in the future, and I used to write more fiction, and I got to a stage where I couldn't see the difference between fiction and magic, in the sense that of kind of like patterns and the imagistic sort of materializations in reality. But yeah, I absolutely think that that we do have the ability to, in whatever you don't really need to. I don't think you really need to work out what the physics of it is, other than to appreciate, the reality of it happening. But that's more like a hermetic reality, like the alchemists, were aware that the microcosm and the macrocosm, and that performing an experiment in the macrocosm will affect the microcosm, and once you accept that hermetic reality, then you don't really need to sort of reduce it to the kind of mechanics of how that happens, other than to accept that separate reality, if you like, or that hermetic reality. So, I'm so used to being in that reality that I don't really feel as I need to explain it in terms of the physics of it, which obviously, like things like chaos magic and people like Peter Carroll were attempting to do, which is very interesting. And I love his idea of retroactive enchantment and this kind of thing. And I think that's certainly influential in the way that I think about creativity and magic. But the other interesting aspect, not quite the idea of these kind of tulpas being generated by thought forms, but the other way, that I got a strong sense of the black plaque recipients being like these kind of almost like clown demons that were gradually coming into my consciousness. And they would, a sense that these were encroaching my kind of my consciousness, like sort of clown demons and things like that, which is a bit more like sort of, I guess, Ligotti type thing. Ligotti's reality, really, Thomas Ligotti's sort of view. And I think Ligotti's very interested in that idea of who's controlling who and who's the puppet and who's the puppet master. And there are these encroachments, if you like, as well as the tulpas or whatever. So it happens both ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is a person the tulpa of a tulpa, or it's tulpa the There's one line in the collection book that made me stop and think for a while, because it's something I think about often too. This idea that most hauntings begin in the future. What kind of led you to that statement?
Well, it's kind of similar to what I was saying. This kind of the idea of encroachment. Things are encroaching you from different planes of time, really. That once you step outside linear time, you got all these kind of encroachments. But that particular thing was about so it was interesting, is that it was kind of a sort of light-hearted piece about this sitcom in Britain called Dad's Army, which was about like the Home Guard, who were kind of like sort of old duffers who were going to protect the country, and stuff like that. They were too old to go to war and stuff like that. And it was a very funny comedy. But at the end of that episode, end of each episode, there'd be this quite haunting scene at the end where they'll be on maneuver and they hear this air raid siren and these drums roll and things. I always remember being quite spooked by that. And so when I came to write that chapter, I realized that writing this piece was a haunting from the future to my childhood memory of being quite scared and thinking that's because my future self is going to write about it in a quite eerie context. So it's haunted me from the future. And so I got the kind of idea that most hauntings are come from some sort of future manifestation of it. And that's kind of quite like I guess Peter Carroll's idea of retroactive enchantment and shadow time and stuff like that.
Yeah, and the sort of retro causation stuff. That have you read the books by Eric Wargo? Like that's
no, I haven't. No.
Yeah, time loops is one. He's in that one. He's approaching it more of a physics angle, but still kind of he's citing sort of the kinds of occult or paranormal like literature that.
Excellent. No, I'll check that out. Yeah. No, this is kind of, as you say, anything that kind of disrupts linear reality. And I think a lot of, this conversation we're having now is making me think about lots of things that interest me that were attempts to disrupt, conventional reality. As say, Cut Up was there to, Burroughs was being cut up. He says, cut up cut up reality and the future leaks through or something like that. So, all these mechanisms are ways of disrupting that and to enter a more kind of psychodramatic universe, which, personally really enjoy that sort of psychodramatic dangerous archetypal reality is another term that comes from Artau, which is a good way of terming it as well. Dangerous, not in the sense of any kind of political political moral transgression, but dangerous as in like a psychic reality, as the one that can drive you mad,
Tangential tantrum.
Exactly. Yeah.
And film feels like that. Film feels kind of like, I'm not saying breaking any ground here with the magic of film, but it's like film is kind of a time distortion where, you talk about Sharon Tate's final film in relationship to the town where Witchfinder General was filmed. And it's kind of like, again, like how does the Cielo Drive Manson story still keep layering? Like I was reading your story and I saw that clip of the ending of that film, 13 Chairs. And it's like, how does this guy look just like Manson in the last frame? Like, this is crazy.
It's mad, isn't it? Yeah, it's crazy stuff. But it's fun. I'm actually, I'm working on another book for Repeater called Enter the Cineplasm, which is about kind of the sort of the kind of sort of febrile space between film and reality, the queasy sort of space, which and I term it the cineplasm, this kind of living entity that exists between film and reality. And that's based on, I got the concept of the cineplasm from this book, film called Symbiosis Psychotaxoplasm by William Greaves, which is an amazing book on the layer of reality and sort of quantum reality of filmmaking. So yeah, I'm sort of going deeper into that particular chapter, really, from Witchfinder. I'm fascinated by the kind of like an inner cinema, if you like, which is a kind of cinema and our projection of our imagination into reality and things like that. So yeah, it's in general, Manson's an incredibly resonant story that seems to keep on giving. But also, cinema itself's got a lot of these kind of stories as well. Because it is magic. Because the director is performing kind of some strange magic there, where he's harnessing all these different correspondences. You got actors, you got scene, location, music, you've got the crew and things like that, but what he's doing is he's it's a very ritualized ceremonial thing to deliver a version of reality. It's a very potent form of kind of manipulating the reality of the viewer, really.
Yeah, you must be able to trace film back to theater and then that directly, but it must be like a straight through line from film back to ritual, like literally,
Yeah, there's a book about theatre and ritual, but the interesting thing was I went to these caves near Nottingham a few weeks back, these Paleolithic caves, and they'd found the only prehistoric art in Britain. So they had bison and things like that, but they had bison. They had multiple lines drawn for the back and things like that. And what the archaeologists perceived is that when they shone, when these were actually film shows, because the drawing of multiple lines around the kind of body and shining torches on them to the audience would create this illusion of movement. So that was the first cinema, really.
It's crazy,
and I think this is like, wow, the cinematic reality.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Huh. Do you think anyone's going to do the entire itinerary of your new book?
No. You probably won't read the entire itinerary. Well, I got it. I think most people, there's a coffee table.
Yeah.
I'd be happy if they read all the itineraries. But no, I would love to meet someone who did. Yeah.
Yeah, the stays, that would be incredible. Oh my God. Trip around the world.
Yeah. Maybe they'll give me a TV program and I can do it. That was the idea.
Funding it.
So we got this guy in England who did this. This was another sort of in joke for the book. There's this guy called Michael Palin, who's a comedian with not 40 Tales, Monty Python. He ended up writing all these travel series around the world, like around the world with Michael Palin. So I thought, I'm like an astral Palin, like an astral plane.
So what are you working on these days? This new book on cinema you're speaking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's been going on a couple of years. So I'm just going through that quite slowly, but at the moment I'm writing some new music. So I've got this book out of the way, and I want to go back and write some music and probably short stories for the next year or so. Just writing, probably just do a zine of short stories, just to get. I've always enjoyed writing short stories, and I never really fancied writing a novel. But I feel I want to write some fiction, so it'll be kind of like, who knows what it'll be? Yeah, I've got ideas and there's stuff in the can, but it's how it gets realised. So so there's 2 or 3 things on the go. So some music, this ongoing cineplasm, then some fiction as well.
Yeah, and the music part of the English Heretic was a huge part of the project, right? Releasing lots of
it was, yeah. I mean, it was, it was until the anthology came out, I was probably more known for the music than the writing, really. They were equally important, really. But I kind of, I mean, there's things with the way that I did the music that I think it was slightly over codified, because it all had this literary stuff. So I want to sort of loosen that connection, really, and let the things breathe in their own way, or develop in their own way without it having to tie in specifically with a narrative and things like that. But ultimately, I think there always will be there will always be a slight narrative to the music. But it was a big part for a long time. We did a fair amount of gigging and stuff like that, but I got a little bit tired of the gigging in particular, because I ended up being kind of like the band manager, because towards the end we had like 5 or 6 people in the band, and so I'd be driving them there, and then they'd be taking drugs and I'd have to drive them home. This wasn't the idea.
Yeah, right. Oh my God. That's hilarious. So thanks again so much for coming on. I guess we can wrap up there, but I feel like we
thanks for having us.
Talk about so much. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's lovely to kind of know that people are, really engaging with your stuff, in the States, really, because it's English Heretic. I've always kind of had a really enthusiastic and audience in the States. It's really good to hear. It's really,
I could absolutely see the connection with industrial music and that. But the collection, I highly recommend it. Some really, you're making these amazing connections, but you're also unearthing these strange connections. I mean, Kenneth Grant and Doctor Who would have thought,
Oh dear. Planet of the Spiders.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, thanks again. We really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure to be on. Yeah. And can you let us know when it's out? So